Part of the focus of celebrating our birthday today, and happy birthday, USA. We know how to mess things up, there's no question, and we know how to do a whole lot of good in our world. And it's real easy in times like these for us to lose sight of the good we've done. In a few moments, we'll share communion together. And the focus of communion is to remember. And in the litany that we will read together, it will be a reminder of some of the things that we've done that have been wrong, that have harmed others, that have been inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus, whom we call the Christ, and in whose memory we share communion. Let me give you a little background on the Chronicles reading and on Solomon. As the reading acknowledges, Solomon was King David's son. Now, David was close to Jonathan, very close to Jonathan, really close to Jonathan, King Saul's son. Jonathan, oh Jonathan, you have loved me with a love that is better than that of a woman. David had a bunch of wives and even more concubines. His men were away at war, but he didn't go and fight with them. He stayed in Jerusalem. And he noticed this beautiful woman bathing on a housetop not far from where he was. Y'all remember her name? Bathsheba. Well, David decided that he needed to become intimate with Bathsheba. And then they found out she was pregnant. And her husband, a general in David's army, was away fighting, so David called him home, encouraged him to go be with his wife so that they could hide her pregnancy as being a part of her husband coming home and being intimate with her. Well, her husband was so dedicated to his men, he said that if they can't be with their wives, then I'll not lay with my wife. When David found that out, he panicked, and so he sends Bathsheba's husband back to the front lines and commands that he lead an attack, which was David's way of making sure that her husband didn't come home. And that happened. He died in war. Bathsheba did have a son who died in birth. And David saw it as God's judgment upon his sin. And he was so weakened that those who were his enemies at court tried to take over the kingdom. In the battle, one of David's other sons, Absalom, was killed. And David cried out, "Absalom, oh Absalom, would to God that I had died instead of you." Well, David and Bathsheba continued in relationship, and they had another son, and his name was Solomon. And Solomon built the temple, not to himself, but to honor God. That's the background to the story. David is referred to as a person after God's own heart, and he was in many ways, primarily because he knew when he needed to repent and confess his wrongs and sins. We don't talk about sin much these days, but I don't think there's anybody sitting here who thinks he or she has gone through life without doing something wrong. The good news is God's grace is always there. And so we can let go of some of those things. It was interesting that this passage that we read from Chronicles was to be read by our president this week in the celebration of our country. Wow. If my people, as we talked about last week, all people are God's people. For God so loved all the world. Happy birthday, USA. We're not a country founded on a particular faith, for we have many faiths. And the founding of our country brought people who were fleeing Europe in religious persecution or at best religious toleration. And they came here seeking freedom. But we were a nation of many denominations, many faiths, and no faith. We'll find that in our conversation next week that at the time of our establishment as a nation, you have to speak in two different eras. Northern Europeans started migrating into the United States primarily in the 1600s, 1630s, 1620s, that time period. And so as they migrate in and have wars with indigenous people and take land from indigenous people, they settled in the eastern part of the United States. And they formed into colonies. And it's those colonies that were there under the rule of England that led to the revolution. I'm telling you the history that we all know and understand, so maybe I don't need to. Some estimate that at the time of our founding, the number of people that were religious or identified with a religious denomination was somewhere between 8% and 15%. Think about that. 8% and 15%. Martin Marty is the historian that says around 8%. And then there's a book that we'll talk about a little bit next week called The Godless Constitution that put it at more like 10 to 15%, perhaps. Not necessarily large numbers of individuals. We'll talk more about that later. So we were a nation of many faiths and no faiths. James Madison, in taking notes of the Constitutional Convention, noted that most of the fires of religion had gone out in the leaders who gathered to form this less than perfect union. The treaty with Tripoli is important because it acknowledges what happened in 1797. So we're talking about 150 years after people started showing up in the colonies. We're talking about 1776, 21 years after the Declaration of Independence. And this treaty, which was passed unanimously by 23 U.S. senators, some of them weren't present, but it passed unanimously. And the goal was to form this treaty with Tripoli so that they would protect our shipping in northern Africa, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. We sing in the Marine Corps hymn. So while we were a nation of many faiths, we were not considered by the leaders of the nation to be a Christian nation. Let me conclude with this. Can a nation filled with injustice be healed? And I don't need to go through a litany of the injustices of our day, but you know something's wrong. When the office of the President of the United States is used to personally enrich himself to the tune of $2.2 billion in a year. And that's according to his financial statements. Wife made millions, the vice president and his family made millions. When the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, Amos tells us there's injustice in the land. That's the bad news. The good news is it will get righted. We will get back to our core beliefs as people of faith, that to care for the poor, the hungry, the disenfranchised is the path of our faith. Reverend Warnock, U.S. Senator from Georgia, took one of the administration's leaders through Matthew 25 this week, asking him which policies reflected clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, caring for the imprisoned. What policies were consistent with the teachings of Jesus? Enough said. Can a nation be healed? Yes. And ours will be healed when we get back to doing the things that are consistent with caring for the people that Jesus calls us to care for. And we'll get there. We just have to be patient. And I want patience as much as anybody does, and I want it right now. So, we'll talk some more about this next week. But that's how we're healed. And now, whoever has that microphone, if you'll bring it down to me, I would appreciate it. Michael, thank you for getting your steps in today. We appreciate your help. We're going to stand together and sing "This Is My Song." Don will come down and do his invitation to giving, and then we'll have our offertory and doxology, and we'll move into communion at that time.